All right, so on, in this final talk, which, you know, I think follows nicely from what I've just said about Lennerberg, we'll go back to one of the issues that I, you know, discussed, namely domain specificity. And I want to relate this notion of domain specificity with the fact that if you look at the biolinguistics literature of the last, I don't know, 5–10 years, you often see mentions not so much of the genetic blueprint for language, but also you find references to the Evo-Devo literature. That is, somewhat schizophrenically, linguists say we can ignore development, we idealize, and we say that basically language acquisition is instantaneous, but at the same time linguists say, but you know, we assume a biology where development is really important, okay? And then they don't try to just, you know, put those two things together. But it's certainly true that you find references to Evo-Devo work. And the point of this presentation is actually to say that I'm not sure which Evo-Devo those linguists really have in mind. Because when you turn to the Evo-Devo literature, you find a lesson that's, of course, more consonant with what Lennerberg said, but that's actually quite at variance with what linguists seem to need in order to back up their claims, biologically speaking. And the illustration that I'd like to choose to make this general point comes from a famous paper published by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch in 2002 in Science called, you know, what's language, what's the language faculty, who has it, and how did it evolve? And one of the important, perhaps the most important thing that has emerged from that paper is a distinction between the faculty of language in the narrow sense and the faculty of language in the broad sense. And this has actually been taken, my impression is, as a foundational distinction in the field of biolinguistics, or in the field of linguistics trying to figure out what the biological foundations of language really are. And I'll just show you using you know, results and also perspectives from biology, that really that distinction between the faculty of language in the narrow sense and the broad sense just doesn't make any sense, biologically speaking. So, in other words, it's wrong to take that distinction as foundational, because if we take that as foundational, right from the beginning we are making an important mistake. We are departing from biological wisdom. And you know, if your goal is to meet biology eventually, you can't basically take as your starting point that you don't want to listen to what they have to say. Okay? All right. So Müller, an important figure in Evo-Devo that Pedro already mentioned in his presentation, tells us that Evo-Devo is characterized by a series of questions, issues, such as the following: organismal form, shape, morphological structure, and the generative mechanisms underlying their evolution are really the things that Evo-Devo wants to tackle. Don't focus too much on the adjective generative. It's not the same as generative grammar, but these are the issues that Evo-Devo are concerned with. They'd like to somehow answer this, okay? And as part of the generative mechanisms underlying their evolutions, Evo-Devo researchers have stressed the importance of understanding the origins of novelty, both in the context of development, ontogeny, and evolution, phylogeny. That is, one of the central issues of current Evo-Devo is what explains the emergence of radically novel structures, okay? The origins of a novel complex phenotype is really something that Evo-Devo researchers would like to understand and have, you know, contributed to our understanding of, okay? And they've confessed that the issue is largely unresolved in the context of evolutionary biology, certainly. In fact, that issue of novelty was disregarded in the context of the modern synthesis. So Ernst Mayr said, well, you know, yeah, I know novelty is important, but not for me, okay? and therefore not for most of the biologists of the modern synthesis. The Evo-Devo practitioners try to bring back that issue into the central fold of biology. And they confess that while biologists have made great progress over the past century and a half in understanding how existing traits diversify, we understand much less when it comes to how novel traits come into being in the first place. Okay? So it's one thing to talk about diversification of something that already is there, and it's another to find out how that thing got there in the first place. Okay? And one of the things that Evo-Devo quickly learned is that the extraordinary morphological diversity that exists at the level of organisms and their parts is not paralleled with by a corresponding diversity in genetic and developmental mechanisms. So one of the big lessons of Evo-Devo of the past 20, 25 years is that the mechanisms of development and also the genetic circuits involved are highly conserved, right, across species. Nonetheless, the species, the phenotypes at the end product are quite different. And so Evo-Devo is trying to struggle with, on the one hand, the near universality and the level of genetics and development and the real diversity that they find at the end product. At the lower level of, say, genetics or maybe even development, you find something that's highly conserved, shared, and not specialized, okay? And Müller and Wagner, I think, made an important contribution to the Evo-Devo by defining a novelty as a structure that is neither homologous to any structure in the ancestral species, nor homologous to any other structure of the same organism. Now, try to remember that definition because I think it's a very important one, because it should remind you of actually what Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch said in their famous 2002 paper. As I told you in the preview of this talk, Hauser et al. Introduced a distinction between FLN and FLB and defined FLN as something that's specific to language and specific to humans. So if you go back, they basically, although they didn't quote Müller and Wagner, already back there they were sort of alluding to the Evo-Devo literature because they were saying that the faculty of language in the narrow sense is a novel trait. Okay? It's a novelty. It's a structure that's neither homologous to any structure in other species, so specific to humans, nor homologous to any other structure in the same organism, that is specific to language. Okay? Specific to humans, specific to language. So they could have alluded to the Evo-Devo literature on this and say, see, we have a perfect case for novelty. Okay. And they stressed throughout the paper that something about the faculty of language must be unique in order to explain the differences between humans and other animals. Okay, so they continue basically a trend that Chomsky has been famous for, namely, there has to be something highly special to language. Okay. So far, so good. Now, what's interesting is that in the same paper, Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch, when motivating the distinction between FLN and FLB, pointed out that this was an attempt to make progress in the context of the biology of language or biolinguistics, because they pointed out linguists and biologists, along with researchers in other fields, can move beyond unproductive theoretical debate to a more collaborative, empirically focused, and comparative research program if we basically rely on a distinction that is the FLN-FLB distinction. So in other words, they were pointing out, if you want to go beyond something unproductive when it comes to debates in the context of biology of language, really you should try to recognize a critical distinction between what's shared across species and what's unique to humans. So they put forth a distinction as an attempt to move beyond unproductivity. And my point in the rest of the talk is actually that distinction leads to unproductive theoretical debates. Okay? Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch are correct that it seems likely that some subset of the mechanisms of the faculty of language in the broad sense is both unique to humans and to language itself. So that's the novelty aspect, okay? And that's what they call FLN, okay? Let's skip, you know, how exactly, what exactly they claim FLN is, whether it's recursion or not, I think is not particularly relevant for this talk, okay? But what's really important is that they say it's critical, that distinction itself is critical for productive discussion of language evolution. Not so. Fitch in 2010, discussing other, you know, examples, write the following. What all the examples that he discusses that don't need to concern us today make clear is that the distinction between general and linguistically specialized mechanisms is hard to draw, even in those cases where the mechanisms themselves seem fairly clearly defined. Most areas of language are not and will not soon be so clearly defined, and thus the distinction itself, that is, between what's general and what's linguistically specialized, the distinction itself is of little use in furthering our understanding of the mechanisms. Now, I think if I recall correctly, Fitch was a member of the Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch paper. And I can't understand how he actually wrote in 2002 that the distinction was crucial to moving towards productive debates, and in 2010 basically say that the distinction is of little use in furthering our understanding of the mechanisms. I see some interesting contradiction in there. But quite apart from what Fitch wrote, I think that the history following the Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch paper showed that the debates based on the FLN-FLB distinction aren't very productive. One of the papers trying to test whether recursion is found in other animals, by Bloomfield, Gentner et al., suggest, or conclude rather, that perhaps this is a good time to reconsider whether attempting to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative differences is helpful if the quantitative advantage is vast. Here, basically, they were alluding to a point that Lennerberg already made. Perhaps we should recognize that general mechanisms could be at the heart of something that's highly specific in terms of behavior, for example. But this doesn't seem to be a point that Chomsky, Hauser, perhaps Fitch, at least at one point, appreciated. The debate between Jackanoff and Pinker and Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch really showed that, you know, the distinction isn't particularly productive. Jackanoff and Pinker, I think, were right to point out that the dichotomy, which makes space only for completely novel capacities and for capacities taken intact from non-linguistic and non-human capacities, just doesn't leave enough room for a compromise that we'll see later biologists would actually accept. And Jackanoff and Pinker, I think, were right in saying that the FLN-FLB distinction really makes certain hypotheses, namely the most plausible ones from the perspective of biology, impossible to state. The hypotheses, incidentally, that Lennerberg would have favored. Okay? I'm saying this because one thing that's very important for Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch is FLN really is a subset of FLB structures. FLN for them really can't be a superset, for example, of FLB. So in other words, Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch can't assume that, well, what Lennerberg actually suggested, that when you have various general mechanisms integrating with one another, you could actually get a novel structure, simply as a result of interactions of shared mechanisms. Well, that's not possible to say if you have an FLN-FLB distinction in the sense of Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch, because that would require FLN to be a superset, not a subset of FLB. But this is not how this graph taken from the Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch paper actually suggests. So I think we have to conclude that the distinction isn't particularly productive. So I'll skip many of those quotes by Jackanoff and Pinker that I think make points that you know, we don't have to go into the details of. And actually go back to a passage of the Fitch, Chomsky, and Hauser reply to Jackanoff and Pinker to actually get to a point that I think has been minimized in the literature, but I think it's a particularly important one. Now, it's true that Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch in different combinations have said that something about the faculty of language must be unique in order to explain the differences between humans and the other animals. And then they have added in the 2005 paper, if only the particular combination of mechanisms in FLN. This seems to at least acknowledge the possibility that, you could have various shared mechanisms that, taken together as a conjunction, could be FLN, in other words. But Chomsky, in many publications, this is the most recent one in 2000, have actually addressed this point and say a question could be asked, namely whether whatever is innate about language is specific to the language faculty, or whether it's just a combination of the other aspects of the mind. Chomsky acknowledges that this is an empirical question, and he said there is no reason to be dogmatic about it, although I think sometimes people have been dogmatic about it. You just look and you see. Perhaps it's not so easy as you look and you see. But certainly Chomsky has been consistent in saying what we seem to find is that it's specific, that it's sui generis. And that point, what I would like to stress, goes directly against what Lennerberg would have predicted on biological grounds and what Evo-Devo practitioners today predict on biological grounds. Namely, it is an empirical question, but biology strongly tells us that the only way you get novelty is through combinations of other aspects of the traits in questions, in this case, the mental organ we call language. And so here we find, I think, an important aspect of current biolinguistic thought, one that's been preserved for 40 years, namely, it seems that we want something highly specialized right from the beginning, for example, in the genes. But biologists tell us this is not how novelty arises. I'll give you a couple of quotes and then conclude. Well, this one may be enough, actually, to gain time. Mary Jane West Eberhardt says that phenotypic novelty is largely reorganizational rather than a product of, say, innovative genes. In other words, we have biologists, I could give you more quotes of this vintage, that say if you want to explain novelty, you have to really look at shared traits that together form a conjunction and a new structure emerge. But you shouldn't assume that behind this or below this new structure you have something highly specialized. That seems to be a lesson that linguists haven't assimilated from biology. And so even though you find a lot of references to the Evo-Devo literature, one of their central issues, namely the focus of novelty, has yet to be assimilated. This is just, I think, one aspect of how biologically illiterate linguists have been for 40 or 50 years. And I think it's sad if we define the field as oriented towards biology. At the very least, we should pay more than lip service to what biologists have to say in the domain of novelty and in other domains that, I'll leave for another occasion. So, thank you.